Hey, thanks very much for joining me and gracing me with your time, my dear friends. I'm going to talk today about your level of consciousness. By the way, when I say your level of consciousness, consider that I'm speaking to myself. This isn't a preachy thing. This is very much like thinking aloud. And as in the rest of my posts, I must ask you to like, subscribe, and particularly to comment. Comment is so important with any of these posts for the reason that certainly if you're of African origin, your voice is not likely to be heard in many places outside of your silence. And my video will be seen by people outside of our traditional silos. So, what is the level of your consciousness? Let's start with the way life works. Every game has rules. You play soccer, you're not allowed to handle the ball. You play rugby, handling the ball is very, very important. So if you have a team on a soccer field, on a football field, which continues to handle the ball, you'll get the yellow cards and then they'll be followed by the red cards. And after a while, you won't have a team left on the field. It's so important to understand the rules of the game you're playing. Life is, quote unquote, another game. If we don't understand the rules on which life are run, we will run awry of the referee, and very soon we will all be red carded in ignominy. So, most of us were taught certain rules about how the natural world works. It's mostly based on, if you like, Newtonian physics and has a real kind of emphasis on the material aspects of life that you can see. Typically, things which you can either measure with instruments or things which are based on our five senses. That is the sense of sight, the sense of smell, the sense of taste, the sense of hearing, and the sense of touch. So, naturally, raised as we are along these lines, if you can't see it, smell it, taste it, hear it, or touch it, technically it doesn't exist. And so our focus has been on the material aspects of all of our lives. Jobs we have, the cars we drive, the homes we live in, the people we date, the status we have, the fame we have, the social recognition we have, and so on and so forth. And really, everything outside of that, that kind of spectrum of, of qualities is pretty much, you know, irrelevant, if you like. So, but you and I both know that even though this is the philosophy that is imposed on us by social media, by the television, by the other media, and so on, cosmetics companies, even though these are the values that are imposed on us, you and I both know that there is another level of life, and it happens at the level of feeling and intuition, if you like, spiritual qualities of life. Now, these are far more difficult to measure. And because we are focused on the material aspects of life, we tend to overlook the spiritual dimension of life, and yet it's playing very hard in the background. Now, there's a philosophy which says that as within, so without, as above, so below. The Buddhists put it a particular way. They say that the self and the environment are two, but they are not two. They call it Esho-fu-ni. Now, they are two because we're clearly physically separated. If you look at the marbles behind my screen, they are all separated. But according to this philosophy, At some level, they are all one. The same applies to you and I. So this connection happens at the quantum level of life, and it has profound implications. Because what it says is that how you are is how the environment manifests. Now, if you don't understand this very important, very basic rule of life, you will be committing howlers all the time and being yellow carded, then double yellow carded, and finally red carded, and you'll be off the pitch and useless to yourself and to the rest of your team. The people who run the world in which we live know these rules very, very well. One. Two, they absolutely decline and refuse to teach you those rules. And it's effectively like your coach putting you onto the football field, having trained you to do 30-yard benders that go straight between the sticks and into goal, but not telling you that actually you're not allowed to handle the ball. So when you get a cross-field pass, what's stopping you just grabbing the ball, putting it down by your feet so you can do what you're really good at, which is smashing the ball a long way and with great accuracy? Of course, you would be off the pitch. So our rulers, visible and invisible, do not teach us the laws of the game. Even when it comes to the realm of philosophy and religion, often these things aren't taught. And so people are left completely bereft and without comprehension. Now, this is where I want to share the screen with you. There was a man, he was actually a physician and a psychiatrist. He ran the biggest psychiatric practice in the state of New York. He was born 1927. His name was Dr. David R. Hawkins. And what Hawkins created was what he called a spectrum of consciousness. This was a logarithmic scale, meaning effectively that there were far more people at the bottom of the scale than there were at the top of the scale. And I'm going to share my screen with you now on what the Hawkins spectrum of consciousness is. Okay, and here we are. This is the Hawkins spectrum of consciousness. What he's basically saying is that within human consciousness, the most common states of being are shame, guilt, apathy, grief, fear, desire, anger, and pride. I've just been reading this here. I've had to kind of overlay the script in a darker script so you can actually read it. Now, the characteristics that go with these states of consciousness, these states of mind, is that they manifest based on an external agency working on you. I can't command you to become angry. Even if you're acting it, you won't act it with the same force as somebody who was completely lost their what. But if I were to say the right words, say about your mum or your children, or yourself, or your appearance, or your work, or your morality, it'd be very easy to trigger that state of anger from your life. So these are states which are driven, their manifestation is controlled very much from outside of ourselves. Then if you look at the top end of the spectrum of consciousness, you have things like courage, neutrality, willingness, acceptance, reason, love, joy, peace, and what he called enlightenment at the top. And remember, this being a logarithmic scale, it'll be far harder to achieve the highest states of consciousness than it is to fall into fall into is a good expression, into the lower states of consciousness. Now, what does that say? What it says is that these higher states of consciousness require inner power on your part to bring about. The ones beneath, the lower states of consciousness, only need external manipulation by somebody to trigger. But no amount of external manipulation is going to trigger your enlightenment. This is something which requires your own self-will. And what Hawkins did was that he put the state of courage as the cutoff point at which the higher states of consciousness start to manifest. Now, this is crucial. What it means is that until you are able to reach a stage in which you can create courage within your being, within yourself, it will be very difficult for you to really start to create value with your environment and reach states such as love, joy, and peace. You can have ersatz love, which is lust. That's a piece of cake. That is right down here in the state of desire. That is just a question of putting the right inducement in front of you for you to fall into the state of lust. But to actually manifest love, there are people who abuse their children. So even putting your child in front of you is not guaranteed to manifest a state of love if it's not there in you and if you don't have the power within to exhibit that state of life. Now, people talk about these different states, and one of the things I think I ought to illustrate perhaps the two right at the bottom. By the way, guilt and shame are lower even than bereavement. These are lower states of consciousness than grief, say when you're bereaved. What guilt and shame is about is something that makes you feel less worthy, less valued, absolutely helpless and hopeless. It is guilt and things like guilt and shame are the kind of emotions that can drive people to suicide. Okay? And it happens these days all the time. There's guilt and shame about your appearance, your status, your achievement levels, your looks, your where you live, your postcode, your sense of dress, the kind of cosmetics you use. All of these things are triggers, powerful triggers everywhere around us to drive us into a state of guilt or shame. There are other far more subtle ones, of course, where, for example, if as a result of how you were raised, you didn't feel appreciated by your principal caregivers, that's an incredibly heavy burden to carry, and it'll be playing in the background all the time. Now, remember what I said is that as within, so without. So imagine a person who deeply in their consciousness harbors a sense of guilt or shame. Well, what you'll do is that you will reproduce that 100% in your environment. Now, this is the trick that those who run this world understand. So if you can guilt trip people into thinking that unless they take a particular medication, they become a danger to their society, guilt and shame, they immediately lose their ability for rational thought and everything, fall into this dense state of being, and they're very easy to manipulate. Remember, the states of life, from pride down to shame, are all externally manipulated. And so you can see all of this stuff that's going on, children are now being primed by educational classes, which is giving them very different views about gender to the ones, let's say, I was raised with. Now, the main point of all of this is that who controls the media, who drives the news agenda, can feed you with enough hate and worthless porn to keep you in the lowest states of consciousness possible. Let me come out of this screen now. So it's really simple. What I'm trying to say is that somehow we must, by some process, find a way of raising our level of consciousness. In another way, people talk about the ascension of the world from a third density consciousness to a fifth density consciousness. And really, that's what the ascension from third density, which is very much the world of us v them, divide and rule, duality, binary, good versus bad, without thinking about shades of grey in between, mass hysteria, and so on. Very third density is exactly the opposite of the fifth density the world is trying to rise up to. In the fifth density, the sensation and the feeling and the thought of love and hope are very, very preeminent. But of course, to get there, as the diagram, as Hawkins's spectrum showed, requires inner work, because those things are inner directed, and the lower consciousness is just a question of putting the right bait in front of you, and like Pavlov's dog, you will start to salivate and manifest those states of life. So those who talk about ascension to the fifth density cannot be talking about the fifth density until they do enough of the inner work which enables them to resonate with love and light. And yes, love and light has a certain manifestation. You can't call it love and light and watch whole swathes of the world be abused for your benefit. You just can't. You can't call it love and light when you see evil standing before you and you acquiesce to it. That's not love and light. In fact, by study of these things, by my own meditation, it occurs to me that the real language of the universe, not the language we have been taught by those who run the world, the real language of the universe is love and respect. Because it is love and respect that connects us all at the quantum level to the universe and to each other. Thank you very much. I hope that this has been helpful. And I hope that we learn the rules of the life which we're living. Whatever we focus on, whatever the state of consciousness we manifest, pops up just like that in our environment. Actually, we are creating the world in which we live. Have a great day and thanks for joining me again.